You're listening ad-free on Amazon Music.
On a hot Sunday afternoon in August of 2016, a young man shuffled into his apartment, dropped his bag, and locked the door. He had gone to a Blink-182 concert the night before, but he was only now getting home. He went into his bedroom and changed into pajamas. Even though it was still light outside, he felt ready to call it a day. He grabbed a blanket and stretched out on the couch to rest, and just as he closed his eyes, his phone rang. It was his father calling from Boston, Massachusetts, and he said he needed his son's help right now. Seconds later, that young man was up and sprinting out the door of his apartment, still wearing PJs. He jumped into his car and sped down the street. 6 minutes later, he skidded to a stop in front of an office building. He ran inside and waved at the security guard as he ran past the desk, shouting that he'd explain later, and then he ran all the way to the back of the building to a large, heavy safe locked with a keypad. He flipped open a panel and quickly punched in the password. Besides his father, this young man was the only one who knew this code. Inside the safe, he grabbed a small box. Then he shut the safe, locked it, and ran back down the hallway, out of the building, back into his car. Then he drove like a man possessed to the Florida Hospital for Children, weaving around traffic, gunning through yellow lights, and totally ignoring the other drivers who honked at him. When he pulled up to the emergency entrance at this hospital, he glanced at the dashboard clock. He knew he'd gotten there fast, but he just didn't know if he'd been fast enough. From Ballen Studios and Wondery, I'm Mr. Ballen, and this is Mr. Ballen's Medical Mysteries, where every week we will explore a new, baffling mystery originating from the one place we all can't escape: our own bodies. If you like today's story, please invite the follow button over your house for a spaghetti dinner, but instead of serving them red sauce, just dump a whole bunch of ketchup on their noodles. On this show, many of the stories we cover are about rare diseases that take people completely by surprise. But sometimes, a condition is so rare, so unexpected, it's hard to believe something like that even exists. But as the people in today's stories find out, they are all too real. On this episode, we have two stories about people who face overwhelming odds against rare, terrifying diseases. Our first story is about a teenage boy whose family vacation to visit his favorite theme parks goes horribly wrong. Then you're going to hear about a young woman whose life is turned totally upside down by a minor kitchen accident. Here's our first story called Look Closely. On August 6, 2016, Sebastian De Leon was slumped in the backseat of a car heading to Orlando, Florida for a short vacation with his parents, Raphael and Brunilda. The drive from their home in Weston, Florida was only about 3 hours. But to 16-year-old Sebastian, the trip felt much longer. He had a lingering headache and his eyes felt itchy and sensitive. He drank some water, rubbed his temples, and focused on the soft rumbling of the car. Sebastian wondered if his headache might be from getting too much sun the day before, since he'd spent the whole day swimming with friends in a lake. But Sebastian worked most of the summer as a camp counselor, so he was outside all the time in the sun, and it never really seemed to bother him, so it didn't make sense to him why yesterday would be any different. Whatever the reason, Sebastian was just totally annoyed at feeling so out of it. He'd been looking forward to this trip to Orlando for weeks. Tomorrow, they had tickets to his favorite amusement park, and tonight they were staying at a nice hotel nearby. It seemed like the perfect dose of late summer fun before school started next month, but Sebastian was worried that he might not feel well enough to even enjoy it. Sebastian groaned, made a pillow out of his duffel bag, and tried to rest. Maybe by the time they got there, the worst of this would be over. But a couple hours later, Sebastian's head was still pounding as his father parked in front of their hotel. Sebastian's parents unloaded the car, and then they all headed up to their room. Sebastian's parents, Raphael and Brunilda, unpacked and got dressed for dinner, but Sebastian felt too dizzy to even think about food. So he crawled into bed and told his parents to go eat without him. He wasn't hungry. Sebastian curled up in the bed, put his blanket over his head, and hoped a good night's sleep would set him straight. But the next morning, Sebastian's head hurt even worse. And now his eyes were starting to ache as well. Even the soft glow of sunlight through the hotel window felt blinding. Sebastian asked his mom to please shut the blinds, but she told him they were closed. Plus, it was cloudy outside. Brunilda sat next to him on the bed and put her hand on his forehead to check if he was feverish. Sebastian winced in pain when she touched him. His skin felt prickly and hypersensitive. Even the bedsheet against his body was very uncomfortable. Sebastian tried to sit up and get out of bed, but the covers suddenly felt too heavy for him to even move. Sebastian felt confused and overwhelmed. He'd never felt so weak and uncomfortable before. It even felt hard to form clear thoughts. He heard his mom making a phone call, then his dad came in and sat beside him. Raphael told Sebastian they were going to take him to a nearby hospital. They had decided that his condition seemed too serious to wait until they got home to deal with. Sebastian's dad helped him get out of bed and get dressed. When his parents opened the hotel room door, Sebastian moaned in pain from the light and turned away. Even with his eyes closed, the light felt almost unbearable. His dad pulled a pair of sunglasses from his shirt pocket and put them on Sebastian's eyes. Then he helped him walk unsteadily down the hallway towards the parking lot. The family reached their car, and Sebastian crawled into the back seat. He heard his parents whispering to each other as they drove away from the hotel. Then Sebastian slipped into a haze. That afternoon, a lab coordinator at the Florida Hospital for Children, named Sheila Black, was drinking coffee between tasks when she heard a knock at her door. It was an assistant nurse with a sample of spinal fluid and Sebastian's patient file. Doctors suspected the young man had meningitis, which is an inflammation of the spinal cord caused by a bacterial or viral infection. One of its most revealing symptoms is sensitivity to light. To test for this disease, Sheila needed to examine the sample of Sebastian's spinal fluid. Sheila thanked the nurse, took the sample to a microscope, and squeezed a dropper of the fluid onto a slide. Then she slid the slide beneath the lens and adjusted the focus. The first thing she saw was that Sebastian's spinal fluid was clear, not cloudy. Spinal fluid is usually clear, but it turns cloudy when it's infected by meningitis. Sheila made a note on the spinal fluid container that Sebastian tested negative for meningitis, but decided to keep studying his sample under the microscope a little bit longer. Overall, the sample looked the way it was supposed to. It was clear, colorless, and scattered with little white blood cells. And so Sheila really had no idea what could be making Sebastian so sick. She scanned through Sebastian's files looking for clues. She noted his age, but then read further to where it mentioned Sebastian had gone swimming in a lake the day before his symptoms started. Going swimming in a lake was not unusual for a Florida teenager, but Sheila had recently attended a seminar about a rare type of microorganism that lives in warm freshwater lakes. When that microorganism enters the human body, it could cause an infection that seems like meningitis, but it's actually much worse. An 11-year-old boy died from this microorganism infection at her hospital only 2 years before, and so Sheila had never forgotten how heartbreaking it felt to be so powerless as that young child slipped away. Sheila hoped her hunch was wrong, but there was only one way to find out. Sheila took another sip of coffee and then leaned in and peered into the microscope again. She stared at Sebastian's spinal fluid sample for a long time, looking for one telltale sign. She couldn't allow a repeat of what happened last time. Then, suddenly, Sheila saw a flicker of movement in the sample. She blinked and looked closer. It happened again. A tiny bulge on one of the white blood cells wiggled. Maybe these were not actually white blood cells. They were something else. Something alive. Maybe they were the very organism she was afraid that Sebastian could have been infected by. Sheila called Sebastian's doctor and told him what she'd just found. If this was what she thought it was, unfortunately, Sebastian was facing a death sentence. Sebastian's doctor, Humberto Liriano, slowly lowered the phone from his ear to his side and leaned his head against the wall. He felt crushed by Sheila's news. As a pediatrician who had treated some of the sickest kids, Dr. Liriano always tried to stay optimistic, even in the darkest times. But sometimes it was hard not to feel totally defeated. If Sheila's finding was accurate, Sebastian did not have much of a chance. Dr. Liriano had treated this same infection 4 other times, and in all 4 cases, none of the patients survived. Still, he felt a deep sense of duty to never give up. No matter how unlikely Sebastian's chance of survival was, Dr. Liriano resolved to fight with everything he had. He made some calls to get a team in place, and then he had Sebastian moved to a room in the critical care unit, and then he went to study Sheila's lab results more closely. And right away, Dr. Liriano could tell from looking at Sebastian's spinal fluid that Sheila's fears were right. This was the worst-case scenario. But there was one ray of hope. Dr. Liriano had heard of a new medication designed to combat Sebastian's condition with this microorganism. It was named Impavido, Spanish for undaunted. But there was a catch. The drug was still undergoing safety review. The makers of Impavido were still negotiating with the Food and Drug Administration for approval to get wider distribution, so very few hospitals were able to stock it, including the Florida Hospital for Children. Dr. Liriano called the hospital's pharmacy. He told them he had a patient who urgently needed Impavido and to call everywhere until they found some. The pharmacist said they would and hung up. Dr. Liriano paced in his office, trying to think of how else he might be able to save Sebastian in case he couldn't get this medication in time. He knew of other patients who had died waiting for it to arrive. Just then, Dr. Liriano's phone rang. It was the hospital's pharmacy. They'd gotten in touch with the Centers for Disease Control, who had already tracked down the CEO of Impavido's manufacturer, which was based right in Orlando. And they apparently said that they had Impavido available and would be happy to supply the hospital with as much as they needed. Dr. Liriano felt a rush of joy at this news until the pharmacist finished their sentence. There was one problem. Impavido was stored in a safe at the CEO's office, and the CEO was out of town. Dr. Liriano groaned in frustration. He asked how long it would be until the CEO could make it back to the office. If the medicine didn't make it to the hospital soon, it would be too late to save Sebastian. The pharmacist said the CEO was away in Boston, Massachusetts through the weekend. There was basically no way he could make it back in time. But there was one other person who had access to the safe, the CEO's son, Michael. Not only that, but Michael was already on his way to get the Impavido for Sebastian. He would then personally rush it to the Florida Hospital for Children. Dr. Liriano was ecstatic to hear this, but none of it would matter if it took too long to deliver the drug, and so he asked where this office was to gauge how long Sebastian would have to wait. And the pharmacist's answer that the company's offices were only about 10 miles from the hospital nearly brought tears of joy to the doctor's eyes. After he hung up with the pharmacist, Dr. Liriano ran to the ER. When he got there, he assigned a nurse to wait by the entrance for the CEO's son, Michael, and the second he got there, this nurse was supposed to take the drug from him and rush it up to the critical care unit where Sebastian was. But there was still one other task that Dr. Liriano had to complete before they could institute this drug, and that was telling Sebastian's parents what was going on with Sebastian. Dr. Liriano steadied himself and then went down the hall to Sebastian's room. He peeked in at the doorway and saw Sebastian lying in bed, barely conscious. His parents, Brunilda and Raphael, sat on opposite sides of the bed, looking totally exhausted and terrified. Dr. Liriano stepped inside and then asked Sebastian's parents to please follow him out into the hall. Dr. Liriano could see in the parents' faces how much they were dreading whatever he was about to tell them. Once they were out in the hall, Dr. Liriano explained Sebastian's situation as clearly as he could. He said their son had caught an infection caused by a microorganism while he was swimming, and now this infection had spread deep into his body and his life was in danger. When he said this, the parents' faces went white. They stared at Dr. Liriano blankly. He told them the good news was that a new medication was on the way to the hospital this very second. The bad news was that Dr. Liriano had never been able to use this medication before so he didn't know for sure if it would even work. Still, it was the best and potentially only chance they had against an infection with a very low survival rate. Only 3% of people who get this infection survive. Dr. Liriano gave the parents a few minutes to absorb this terrible news. Then he explained that in order to use this new medicine, they would have to put Sebastian into a medically induced coma, taking him to the brink of death in order to save his life. So if they wanted to say anything to Sebastian, now was the time. There might not be a later. Brunilda and Raphael nodded and went back into their son's room. They stood on either side of his bed and held his hands. His mother, Brunilda, cried as she told him what a perfect boy he was, and that he was going to be just fine, medicine was on the way that would help him, and God was looking out for him. Sebastian's father, Raphael, made the sign of the cross and squeezed his son's hand. Then he leaned close to his face and told his son how strong he was, how he would beat this, and how they would all live a long, happy life together. Dr. Liriano was very moved by the parents and what they were saying to their son, but at some point he stepped in and asked Brunilda and Raphael to please leave the room, and then he had his nurses prep Sebastian for the medically induced coma, which required them to drastically lower Sebastian's body temperature. The team jumped into action, prepping IVs and hooking Sebastian up to various monitors. Dr. Liriano made sure everything looked good and headed out to the reception desk to wait for the impavido. The whole floor was tense with anticipation. Then the elevator at the end of the hall dinged. Dr. Liriano heard rapid footsteps, and suddenly a nurse sprinted around the corner holding a package. It was the impavido that Michael had brought. Dr. Liriano looked at his watch. He had called the pharmacy less than half an hour ago. Sebastian still had a chance. He ran back to Sebastian's room and quickly opened the container holding the impavido pills. Once Sebastian had taken them, an anesthesiologist sedated him. Within moments, Sebastian was asleep. A nurse gave him an IV drip of cold saltwater solution, while another wrapped him in frozen blankets. Dr. Liriano paced while keeping his eyes glued to Sebastian's monitor. This process would give the medication more time to work, but it was always very dangerous to cool a body so rapidly. Sometimes organs reacted very unpredictably. Within the hour, Sebastian's body temperature was down to 91 degrees Fahrenheit, and Sebastian was officially comatose. Once Sebastian's breathing began to slow, Dr. Liriano gently fed a tube down his throat to help his body maintain a steady flow of oxygen. So far, the procedure had gone exactly as planned. All they could do now was wait and hope. The next morning, Dr. Liriano had some more of Sebastian's spinal fluid drawn to assess how the impavido was doing. He took the fluid down to the lab and studied it under a microscope, and when he looked, he let out a sigh of relief. There were already far fewer tiny wriggling creatures in the sample. The infection had significantly reduced. By the following morning, Dr. Liriano was beginning to believe that Sebastian was actually going to make it. He found Sebastian's parents half asleep on a bench in the waiting room. They jolted awake when he spoke to them. Dr. Liriano told them he didn't want to celebrate too early, but so far, all signs were very positive. When the parents heard this, they cheered and hugged the doctor tightly. But Dr. Liriano made it clear that Sebastian was not out of the woods yet. They still would have to bring him out of the medically induced coma. Dr. Liriano's team began steadily warming Sebastian's body. Minute by minute, his temperature rose until finally he was back at the normal 98.6 degrees Fahrenheit. Dr. Liriano then removed Sebastian's breathing tube and then hovered at his bedside, waiting. Then it happened. Sebastian took a big gulp of air on his own, and his heartbeat remained steady. Sebastian was out of his coma. A little while later, Sebastian's eyes blinked open. He gazed around the room like he'd just woken up from a deep sleep. Dr. Liriano immediately sent a nurse to go get his parents. Brunilda and Raphael rushed inside and threw themselves on their son. Everyone in the room clapped, cheered, and hugged. Dr. Liriano was ecstatic, but also stunned. This wasn't just a miracle, it made history. What Sheila Black found in Sebastian's spinal fluid should have killed him. It's a rare organism called Naegleria fowleri that lives in warm, stagnant waters, exactly like the lake where Sebastian had been swimming. When infected water goes up a swimmer's nose, the microorganism then travels through the body to the brain. Once there, it attacks tissue, basically eating the victim's brain. This causes swelling that eventually shuts the brain down and the victim dies. That's why this organism is commonly known as the brain-eating amoeba. But what confirmed Sheila's hunch that this was a brain-eating amoeba was the organism's particular way of moving. It uses microscopic appendages to row itself like oars on a boat. That's why the microorganisms looked like they were wiggling under the microscope. In 57 years of documented brain-eating amoeba infections, Sebastian had become just the 4th person in the United States to survive after being attacked by them. Dr. Liriano told Sebastian's parents that their son had been both horribly unlucky, but also at the same time extremely lucky. Because if the medicine that ultimately saved his life had been stored basically anywhere else, he probably would not have gotten it in time. Of all the places in the world the medicine manufacturer's headquarters could be, they were also in Orlando, just a few miles from the hospital where Sebastian was. All told, it took less than 20 minutes for the CEO's son to rush and get the medicine and deliver it to the hospital. A few hours after coming out of his medically induced coma, Sebastian was able to speak again. It took 2 years for him to regain all his motor skills, but eventually he made a full recovery. And now for our second story, called Burning from the Inside. On a Sunday night, just after Christmas in 2015, 27-year-old Kayla Hansen weaved through the crowded dining room of Grimaldi's, a popular Italian restaurant in Peoria, Arizona. The restaurant was unusually busy that night. As the manager, it was up to Kayla to keep things organized. So she was doing a little bit of everything, helping out the waitstaff, checking on customers, and generally just making sure everything was running smoothly. For someone less experienced, this whole night might have been totally overwhelming. But Kayla was a veteran and workaholic who regularly put in 60 or 70-hour weeks. She was totally in her element. Closing time was fast approaching, so Kayla grabbed an order of pasta and raced out of the kitchen. As she crossed through the doorway, though, she let her guard down for a second and collided with one of her servers. The tray Kayla was carrying fell to the floor, and Kayla staggered back into the doorframe, and she grabbed the doorframe to steady herself, but before she could get her balance, the door swung back and smashed into her hand. Kayla cried out in pain and yanked her hand back. The server apologized and ran to get some ice, but Kayla waved her away. She wasn't bleeding, and she figured she just didn't have time to ice a minor injury like this. Kayla's hand was in a lot of pain, and she could feel it aching right away, but she shrugged it off and helped the waiter clean up the food that had spilled. Then Kayla finished up her shift and headed home, ready to get some sleep. The next morning, Kayla woke up and felt a throbbing pain in her right hand. She looked down and saw that it was totally swollen and the skin was bright red and tender. It didn't look good. Kayla groaned in frustration. She was supposed to meet her friends for a hike later, but as much as she wanted to ignore the pain in her hand, she knew she really needed to change her plans and go get her hand checked out by a doctor. So she texted her friends and said she would not be able to go on the hike that day, and then she called her primary care doctor and got an appointment for later that day. By the time Kayla got to the doctor's office that afternoon, her hand was really hurting. But when the doctor examined her hand, he told Kayla she had just bruised the soft tissue. Her hand wasn't broken, so the swelling would eventually go down and she'd be fine. Kayla was totally relieved to hear this. It would have been extremely difficult to work at the restaurant with a broken hand. So Kayla figured she'd get better in a couple of days and really just kind of stopped thinking about her hand. It still hurt, but it didn't feel like an urgent matter. 2 weeks later, Kayla was in her bathroom getting ready for the day, trying to brush her hair with her uninjured left hand. Her right hand, the damaged hand, was still swollen and tender, even though it had now been 2 weeks since she hurt it. The swelling really had not gone down at all, and the pain seemed to be getting worse every day. In fact, the pain had gotten so bad on several days over these past 2 weeks that she'd had to call into work sick. Kayla could not afford to keep taking time off of work, so she was starting to feel really worried about her hand again. Kayla fumbled the brush and shook her head in frustration. Then, just kind of out of instinct, she picked the brush back up with her damaged hand. And as soon as she grabbed it, it felt like an electric shock ran up her right arm. Kayla immediately dropped the brush and then grabbed her injured hand. She could feel the skin was incredibly hot to the touch, and it almost felt like it was on fire from the inside out. It was so painful. And now, also, her right arm hurt too, and it was beginning to swell just like her hand. Kayla realized she just couldn't push through this pain any longer. It was horrible, and so she decided she would go back to her doctor. Later that day, Kayla was in her doctor's office as the doctor was examining her swollen right arm. It took Kayla everything she could not to scream out in pain every time the doctor very gently pressed her hand or arm. After the doctor finished his exam, he told Kayla that this was clearly more than just a bad bruise to her hand. But it was not clear to the doctor why Kayla was in this much pain. Her tests and x-rays showed nothing was wrong with her. The doctor thought maybe it was something nerve-related. So he referred Kayla to a pain specialist named Dr. Nicholas Scott, whose focus was on identifying and managing chronic pain conditions. Kayla very carefully cradled her right arm as she thanked the doctor, and then she got up to leave. She hoped Dr. Scott would be able to help her, because she really didn't know how much more pain she could bear. A couple of weeks later, Kayla arrived at the Arizona Pain Clinic for her appointment with Dr. Scott. She hoped he would have an answer for her so she could get better and finally go back to her old life. Not only was she missing work all the time, but Kayla was also in too much pain to go hiking or fishing, or really do much of anything that she used to do for fun. Kayla waited in the exam room for a short period of time before Dr. Scott entered. His calm demeanor put her at ease, but she couldn't help but flinch when he examined her hand, which was still swollen and still had these bright red blotches all over it. Once he was done, Dr. Scott asked Kayla if she knew what might have caused the injury. She told him about her busy night at the restaurant at the end of December and how her hand had gotten smashed in a door, but she didn't see how such a minor injury could cause this much pain and swelling and over such a long period of time. Dr. Scott nodded and told Kayla he could not find any tissue damage or broken bones, just like her other doctor. However, he believed she had developed a rare condition called Complex Regional Pain Syndrome, or CRPS, that can develop after there's been nerve damage. He explained that a nerve in Kayla's injured hand was misfiring and sending signals to the brain that she was in extreme pain, even though the original hand injury was not that bad. Dr. Scott told Kayla that there was no cure for CRPS, but they could find a way to manage the pain and the burning sensation until it went into remission. Now, it usually went into remission after only a few months, but unfortunately for some, as the doctor explained, it could take a few years. Dr. Scott said they had no way of knowing which group Kayla would fall into. Kayla was relieved that Dr. Scott had a diagnosis, but the possibility of living with such excruciating pain for years on end was terrifying. She just hoped that the doctors and her medical team could somehow get this pain under control and get her back to normal life soon. About 9 months later, on December 16, 2016, Kayla was in her kitchen struggling to cook some dinner. None of the pain treatments that Dr. Scott tried had worked. Over the past few months, the horrible burning pain in her right hand and arm had spread across her feet, hips, knees, neck, even her head. Basically, Kayla felt like she was on fire 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Kayla had lost count of how many times she'd been to the emergency room, but no matter what the doctors tried, the pain never lessened. She could barely get out of bed, she'd had to quit her job, and now she was relying on her family to help her financially. Kayla had worked so hard for so long to build her life, and now it was all crumbling all around her, and it seemed like there was nothing anyone could do to help her. Even worse, really dark, depressing thoughts began to cloud her mind every day. All she wanted was for the pain to end, even if that meant falling asleep and never waking up again. But Kayla was determined to try to find some ray of hope in her life, and she knew she got a lot of comfort from her family. So she had decided to invite them all over for a Christmas celebration where she would prepare a meal for everyone. And as she struggled to clear some dishes from the counter, Kayla happened to notice what looked like a fresh burn on her forearm. She tried to remember how she did this. Maybe she bumped into the stove or something and didn't notice, but she really had no memory of getting a burn. Thankfully, though, the burn was small and didn't get any worse, and so Kayla was able to successfully host her Christmas party. It was only a small get-together, but the visit really lifted Kayla's spirits. But on the morning of December 20th, so 4 days after that Christmas party where she noticed that burn on her arm, Kayla woke up to find that her forearm, from hand to elbow, was now completely covered with these small circular burns, just like the one she had noticed 4 days earlier. They looked like someone had stuck her with a white-hot poker, leaving behind bright red blisters. But obviously that wasn't happening. These burns were somehow forming from underneath her skin. Kayla was shocked, and she lifted her arm up to get a better look. When she flexed it at the elbow, the movement caused the burns to crack open and start to bleed. It hurt so much, Kayla couldn't even think. She immediately laid back down and kept her arm at her side to avoid causing any more damage. Horrible thoughts began to fill her mind as she lay there in bed that morning. Kayla imagined grabbing a sharp knife and just cutting her arm off to escape the pain. She kept thinking about the incredible relief that would bring her. But then she realized cutting her arm off would be pointless, because she knew from experience that these horrible pains she was experiencing would always eventually travel to the other parts of her body. Kayla gritted her teeth and then reached for her cell phone and called Dr. Scott. He was astonished by her alarming new symptoms. People with CRPS did sometimes develop burns like this, but Dr. Scott knew that was incredibly rare. In fact, it happens so infrequently within CRPS patients that nobody knew how to make it stop. So for now, the only advice Dr. Scott could give was for Kayla to get to the emergency room and hope the doctors there could do something to treat her burns. When Kayla hung up, she just started crying. She was in so much pain, she was so uncomfortable, and she knew that she was gonna go to the hospital because she was gonna do what she was told, but she knew they were not gonna be able to help her. No one could. Kayla was right. The doctors at the emergency room when she got there were totally baffled by her condition. The only burns like this they'd ever seen were from cancer patients going through radiation treatment. Whatever was doing this to Kayla was coming from inside her, and they just couldn't explain it. Kayla left the emergency room and headed home, still in total agony and feeling completely defeated. The days turned into months, the months turned into years, and at times Kayla's situation felt completely hopeless. Somehow, she always found the strength to keep going despite the unbelievable pain she was always in. By February of 2019, over 3 years after she crushed her hand, Kayla had gone to over 50 different doctors and had tried almost as many medical procedures, but nothing had worked. Finally, though, on what felt like her millionth trip to the hospital for the burns that covered her body, the doctors were at least honest with her. They knew they couldn't help her, and they told her that, but they could at least tell her what was ailing her. She didn't just have CRPS. She had the worst case of CRPS they'd ever seen, and perhaps one of the worst the world has ever seen. Most people who suffer from complex regional pain syndrome have symptoms in a single arm or leg. Unfortunately for Kayla, she suffered from symptoms across her entire body. In other words, she had a unique version of this very rare disorder. One doctor described it as stage 4, the most severe and painful form of CRPS. Kayla had long since learned why doctors sometimes call CRPS the suicide disease, but the doctor spelled it out in agonizing detail. The pain experienced by victims of CRPS can be worse than childbirth, broken bones, or even amputations. The suffering can get so intense that up to 40% of CRPS victims express a desire to want to kill themselves to get rid of the pain. Kayla winced at that last detail because she knew she fell into that 40%. She had had those dark thoughts. And in fact, lying in the hospital bed at that very moment, she couldn't help but think about dying and how really it would be so much easier to just die, because then she wouldn't feel the pain and she'd stop being a burden to her parents and family. Over the next few days, doctors and nurses streamed in and out of Kayla's room really just to see the patient with the extraordinary case of CRPS. Some even took pictures of her just for documentation. Kayla started to feel like she was not really a patient and more of an animal in a zoo exhibit. Then eventually, Kayla's doctors discharged her from the hospital after this latest flare-up subsided, but they were unable to offer any further relief from her crippling full-body pain. A short time after Kayla returned home after that millionth visit to the doctor, something remarkable happened. All of a sudden, for no clear reason, the pain just started to lessen. At first, Kayla hardly noticed, but by April of 2019, she felt noticeably better. By the end of the year, she was no longer covered in those burns and was feeling almost like her old self again. Finally, after almost 4 years of just pain and misery and torture, Kayla's nervous system had healed enough to properly transmit signals to her brain, which meant she was more or less back to her normal self. Although her CRPS will never be completely gone, Kayla was able to return to an active life. She went back to work at a restaurant, and she was recently honored with an award for excellence as a manager.
Befriended a very wealthy landowner in Georgia who offered them access to one of his best private hunting areas. And just a couple of days later, on October 5th, Eben and his father would take him up on the offer. They woke up super early and they drove out to the edge of this property that was actually fenced in. And they went to a main gate where they had the combo that this guy had given them. They punched in the combo, opened up the gate, drove in, shut the gate, locked it, and then continued down the access road. They followed this road for about 2 miles where it came to a stop right outside of this huge forest. They parked their truck, they got out, they put on their gear, and in the pre-morning darkness began hiking into the woods. Even though they were there primarily to hunt, Eben and his father secretly enjoyed just hiking around the woods and camping out, and any chance they got to extend their hunting trips, they would, even if the hunting wasn't good. And so since they spent a ton of time in the woods together, they noticed almost immediately when they walked into this particular forest that something was off. There's no birds, there's no animals. Silence. It's just totally silent. The only sounds they heard that were not them was a single plane that passed overhead. Although they found this very odd, they figured, you know what, this is private property, not a lot of people are out here. I'm sure as soon as we showed up, the animals were aware of us and they've scattered. They finally make it out to the hunting stand that the owner had told them about. They get all settled in, they're getting ready to see some animals. And all day long, they don't see a single animal. They don't hear a single animal. In fact, again, it is just completely silent. Frustrated, they began packing up their stuff, making their way down off the stand, and they started looking for a place to make camp for the night. And Eben's father suggested, well, hey, you know, there's obviously nothing over here. It's been quiet all day. Why don't we walk deeper into the woods a little ways, set up camp there, so tomorrow we have a better chance of seeing some animals. So they hiked for about an hour farther away from where they parked their truck, and they reached this clearing, which is perfect for setting up their camp. And so they set up their tent, and Eben's father says, hey, you know, we still got some daylight. Do you want to go try our luck and see if we can see some animals out here now? Eben's like, yeah, why not? So they hike a little ways away from their campsite and they set up their blind, and once again, they don't see any animals. It's totally quiet. And so they turn around and they start heading back. As soon as they could see their campsite, which really was just their tent, they noticed that their tent was now collapsed. And Eben's father turns to him and says, oh, it must have been the wind. And Eben says, no, it couldn't have been the wind, because all day today we have been commenting on how quiet it is and how the fact that there's no weather, no wind, no anything is heightening the fact that it's completely silent. So it could not have been wind. So Eben's father is like, well, when you set the tent up, did you not put the posts into the eyelets? Did you not build it correctly? And Eben's like, no, I've made that tent like 1,000 times. I know it was set up correctly. They walk into their campsite and they look down at their tent, and they're really confused at what they see. The 2 rods that go in an X over the top of the tent that thread through nylon loops and then anchor at 4 different points on the base of the tent, well, they had been removed from the 4 corners. And if you know how a tent works, it works on tension. And once you have a rod anchored in 2 points, it doesn't just pop out. It's anchored at 2 sides. It's actually difficult to remove each anchor. Once one is out, the other comes out easily. But basically, the rod would need to break in order for it to come out of those anchor points, or someone would have to come over and remove it. And they didn't remove them, and none of the rods were broken. Which leaves them with either they failed to set up their tent, even though they had distinct and clear memories of setting it up and double checking it was set up because they put gear inside of it, or someone came over to their campsite while they were gone and undid the four corners. They decide, you know what, it can't be some stranger coming over here because we're the only ones with the gate combo. This is private property and no one could have been here. And why would they do that if they came to our campsite? Why would they randomly collapse our tent and then vanish? So it had to be us. We must have not made the tent. And while they didn't really believe that they had not made their tent, they convinced themselves that that's what happened because the alternative was just too bizarre and frankly terrifying to consider. So they build their tent and they make a little fire and they stay up for a little while chatting before being tired and saying, okay, let's just go to bed. They extinguish the fire, they get in the tent, and they both fall asleep. A couple hours later, Eben wakes up suddenly and he's not sure if he's dreaming or not, but he thinks he hears someone laughing a couple hundred meters behind their tent off in the woods. Eben instinctively turns to make sure his dad is still in the tent with him, and he is, and then Eben starts listening really intently to what's happening outside. And all he can hear is silence, like it's been since they got in the woods. He doesn't hear any more laughter, and so he says, okay, I must have just been dreaming, and there wasn't any laughter out there, and eventually Eben goes back to sleep. A little while later, Eben wakes up suddenly again, except this time his dad is already awake and looking around anxiously. And Eben sits up and goes, what's going on? And his dad goes, shh. And he goes, can you hear that? And Eben listens, and to his horror, he hears laughing. He wasn't dreaming before. Eben also realizes the laughter is not coming from the same area he heard it. It's now coming from the opposite direction, and it's a lot closer to them. Eben very quietly and carefully explains to his dad that he actually heard this laughter a couple hours earlier. And Eben's father turns to Eben and says, before we came out here, I asked the owner, should we expect any other hunters or campers or anybody nearby? And the owner said, this is private property and it's fenced in. There is no one there but you guys. After this revelation, they both turn their attention back to just listening because they're hoping this is just going to stop and whatever this is just going to leave. But it doesn't leave. They hear footsteps running towards them from way off in the forest. And it's so quiet, it's really easy to hear these footsteps. And whatever this is charging towards them. And then it comes to a complete stop right at the edge of their clearing. At this point, Eben is now grabbing onto his father. Eben's father is holding onto his rifle and he's getting ready to open the tent to confront whatever is out there. And right before he grabs the zipper, this person, whatever it is, starts laughing again. And it's practically right on top of them. It's so loud. They can hear it clear as day right there, right outside their tent. And Eben's father takes a deep breath. He grabs the zipper, and as soon as he begins moving it, the sound the zipper made causes the laughter to stop. They don't hear footsteps, so they know probably something's still out there. But the laughter stops like it's recognized that they're making noise. They're right there. There they are. They're in the tent. Eben's father freezes with his hand on this zipper, and he's debating whether he should go outside or not. And before he can even make that decision, whatever this thing is turns around and runs back into the woods, and it's just gone. And for several minutes, they just sit like that in total silence, praying that whatever this is gone for good. And after several minutes, when they don't hear anything, there's no more laughing, there's no more running, Eben's father re-zips up the tent, puts his hand back down, and they're both left just sitting there thinking, what the heck just happened? Eben and his father would stay up all night, and they would barely speak, because whatever this thing was had heard them when they moved the zipper. And so they were really afraid of making any sound, even little sounds, because it's so quiet, sound travels really far, and they don't know who or what is out there. And so in silence, holding their guns, they're just waiting for the sun to come up. And as soon as it did, they were up and out of there, literally running out of the forest, checking over their shoulder the whole time, all the way back to their truck. And so to this day, they have no idea who or what the heck was running around out there. And they told the owner of the property about it. And the owner just said, it's not possible. We have a totally gated in private piece of property, and there are cameras watching the only entrance. And you are the only ones that went in or out over that time period. And prior to that, we monitor this property. Nobody else was in there. In the summer of 2013, a young woman named Katie and her father decided to go camping at one of their favorite campgrounds in the Sierra Nevada mountain range. Katie loved going camping with her father because he was this totally accomplished outdoorsman, and he used to be a wilderness guide for much of his life, and so she just always felt like she was in great hands whenever she was out in the wild with him, and she had kind of become a fairly accomplished outdoorswoman herself. When they arrived at the campground, the parking lot was packed with cars, and they're like, shoot, I wish we'd called ahead a couple weeks ago and reserved a site because they're probably not even available now. But they went to the front desk and they were like, "You're in luck, we have one available, but it's the one that's way over there." It was this one campsite that was kind of isolated from the rest of the campground. It was far away from the bathhouse, it was far away from where you go swimming, and it was far away from the parking lot. It was just like really inconvenient. And whenever they came camping here, it was like the one site they didn't want to use. But beggars can't be choosers. They were happy to even have a site. And so they drove all the way down this little road into this very isolated campsite, kind of in the middle of this forest. Once they got there, they began setting up their respective tents because they were not going to be staying in the same tent. They each had these very small backpacking tents, which were so small that you could either zip it up all the way and stay warmer and more protected, but you had to sleep in a ball because your legs would not fit otherwise. Or you could unzip the front of your tent, and when you lay down, you could extend your legs fully, but your legs are protruding outside of your tent. So you could only do that in warmer weather and if you were comfortable having your legs poking out into the wilderness. After they set up their tents and they get their coolers set up and they have all their stuff kind of the way they want it, they go out hiking for the rest of the day. When they come back, they're totally exhausted, they fall asleep, and nothing of note occurs over that first night. The next day they get up, they go back out, they go hiking all day all over again, and they come back that night and they are totally exhausted again. And they get into their tents and they go to bed. And this night, something of note would happen. At about 3 a.m., Katie wakes up and she hears footsteps walking towards the campsite from a little ways off. They're in the woods somewhere. And she's thinking, okay, it's got to be my father because he's diabetic and every night he gets up to go to the bathroom maybe 3-4 times, and he probably was just walking to the bathhouse and now he's walking back. But she realizes the bathhouse is over here, not over here. So what is he doing walking towards the campsite from this side? The footsteps come out of the tree line, they come into the clearing that is their campsite, and they stop about 2-3 meters outside of Katie's tent. Now there were no windows on Katie's backpack tent, there was just little vents at the front and the back that kind of pointed down, and so she couldn't see out anyways, and there was no illumination out, so you can't even pick up a silhouette. It's just total darkness out there, she can't see who's out there, she can only hear them. But she's thinking, okay, maybe my dad got lost coming back from the bathhouse because he didn't have a flashlight and he walked too far. That's possible. Or, he could have decided to relieve himself just in the tree line, even though he's not known to do that. He's a guy that goes to the bathhouse. And so she's running through these scenarios that are convincing her that, oh, that's just my dad. But what she really wants to hear is that person walk away from her tent and get into her father's tent, because that will confirm in her mind that that was her father. And so she's sitting here waiting for that confirmation, and she hears the footsteps again, but instead of walking around her tent to her father's tent, this person walks right up against her tent very quickly. And they clearly begin leaning over her little tiny tent because she can hear them breathing right above her. And this is when she realizes, that's not my dad. And as she's having this terrible revelation that some stranger is outside her tent right now, she has an even worse revelation. It was a warm night that night, so she was sleeping with her tent unzipped and her legs poking out the end. She musters the courage to begin slowly retracting her legs back inside of her tent. But before she's able to do that, this person stands up, turns, and starts walking towards the base of her tent where her legs are. She's completely frozen and terrified about what's about to happen. But this person doesn't stop at her feet. They keep moving and in fact start circling her tent. But because they were making a lot of noise and walking around her, it allowed her to pull her legs back into her tent without, this person hearing her. And so she had the illusion of safety being inside of her tent, but her tent is still unzipped. So she's waiting for this person to come around and crouch down and look inside of her tent because it's open. And so she's just looking down there hoping that doesn't happen. But unfortunately, right at this moment, the person walked to the base of her tent and came to a stop, right outside where the opening to the tent is. And so she's sitting there thinking, please don't come in here, please don't come in here, please don't come in here. And even though her feet are pulled up into her tent, she suddenly feels something pinch her foot, and she knows it's a hand. Something has grabbed my foot. And she stifles a scream and she starts shaking uncontrollably because her instincts are telling her, don't let this person know you're awake. And luckily, as she's sitting there shaking from fear and trying to be quiet as best as she can, she's holding her mouth, this person stands back up again and goes back to the spot next to her tent and leans over the tent once again, and she can hear them breathing right over her. And so for several minutes, she lay there shaking with this random person who pinched her foot a minute ago, hovering over her tent in the middle of the night. And she has nothing she can do. And she's just quiet. She's hoping it's going to end soon. And eventually this person would turn around and walk over to their cooler and their table and some other things that were out. And and she hears some rummaging going on, some things are being moved around, and then this person just kind of walks off into the distance. But she doesn't know if they're gone. She doesn't know if they're standing in the edge of the tree line waiting for her to come outside. Maybe they laid a trap for her. And so she just lays there, silent, doesn't move, and she's praying to herself, please don't let anything happen to me or my father. And all night she's just laying there. And then eventually she does fall asleep. Probably hours go by, but she does fall asleep because she wakes up again when she hears her father unzipping his tent, and she charges out to meet him. And she can tell right away that he's scared. And before she can even say or begin to describe what's happened to her, he says, were you outside your tent last night at about 2, 3 in the morning? Because I heard all sorts of commotion near our cooler. I wasn't sure if it was an animal. I wasn't sure if it was you. And she starts telling him, no, this is what happened to me. And as she's describing what happened to her, he looks behind her at the picnic table, which was next to their cooler, and they had their backpacks on it. Basically anything that didn't fit in their tents they kept near this picnic table. And he points at it. And she turns around, and any item that was in the cooler or in their backpacks or that was just out has been stacked in a pyramid formation on this table. Clearly, the guy who was here last night did this for some reason they don't understand. And as they go over to look at it to see if anything's been taken, they notice this track of footprints, like these heavy footprints that have been going around and around Katie's tent. So she clearly wasn't imagining it. And so that instant, they packed everything up, got in their car, and they left. And to this day, they can barely talk about it with each other because it's all the things that could have happened. The father felt horribly guilty because he clearly heard this person but didn't leave his tent. And his daughter was clearly in danger. And his daughter's thinking, the tent was open. This person was crouched down, reaching into my tent, grabbing my feet. Like, that's such a horrifying image. And so this has been completely traumatizing for them, and they just don't talk about it anymore.
Me susurra tu nombre, las estrellas brillan como aquella vez. Recuerdos de lo que fuimos no se van, siguen vivos en mi alma. ¿Dónde estás? Tal vez el destino nos vuelva a cruzar. En tus ojos yo me pueda reflejar un suspiro de esperanza en el aire. Siento que mi corazón no late. Si un día nos volvemos a encontrar, te diré todo lo que callé. El amor que guardé para ti, nunca lo dejé de sentir. Si el tiempo nos vuelve a unir, no habrá nada.
From the 1950s until present, a Canadian family has owned this very isolated cabin in the middle of the Ontario backcountry. It was the only property on this very small lake. There was 2 others across the lake, but they were pretty far away. And with the exception of the side of the cabin that was facing the water, the rest of it was surrounded by really dense forest that went on for quite a while. About 2 miles away from this cabin, on the other side of this dirt road, was this huge wildlife reserve that was pretty much just a huge forest that was protected. And anytime the family was visiting this cabin, the kids would at some point go into the reserve and go explore. In 2001, when the family was at the cabin, the kids were across the road over at the reserve, and they decided to walk down this particular trail that they hadn't seen before, and they just started walking. And for about 30 minutes, they're seeing new areas they hadn't seen before, and then they come to this clearing, and there's all these abandoned houses. At first, there was a little debate about whether these were actually abandoned because they did look like they were in pretty good condition, but when they walked a little bit closer, it became very clear that nature is reclaiming this land. Grass is up to your waist, there's vines growing up the side of the houses, there were cars still parked in driveways that were totally rusted out, and grass is growing all through them, and so they knew these were abandoned. They walked up to the first house they saw, and they looked in, and they couldn't believe what they were looking at. It was like whoever lived here had left without taking anything. The house was still totally furnished. In fact, their dining room tables still had plates and cups and forks and knives, like they had just had dinner and then just got up and left. They start talking about going into these houses and looking around inside, but they started wondering, like, is this a museum? Is that why everything is in such good repair? Should we not go inside these houses? And they start looking around for any indication that definitely this is not a museum, these are just plain abandoned. And across the street from the house they were at was this totally decrepit looking house. Let's go over there and look in there. And so they look in a window, and very clearly the ceiling is totally sagging down. And the first floor is buckling completely, and there's clothes and shoes scattered everywhere. And so for them, this was confirmation that this is no museum. These are abandoned. We can totally go look around inside. And so for the next couple of hours, the kids explored all the houses that looked structurally sound, that weren't going to collapse on them. And it was just fascinating. There was all this stuff that was left behind that was fairly valuable. And they didn't take anything. They just thought it was very cool. And after a while, they decided they had seen enough, and they turned around and headed back to their cabin. After they got back, they told their parents about what they found. And their father was like, man, that sounds awesome. I want to go check that out. And so that day, they went right back over to the abandoned houses. The first house they showed him was the really decrepit looking one where the ceiling was sagging and there was women's shoes and clothes all over the ground, to show him for sure these are abandoned, because we had some doubts at first too. These are definitely abandoned. So they look at that house, and then they went back to the very first house they saw when they walked into this complex, the one that was in great condition and had the dining table still set. So they go inside and they go upstairs, and they find this bedroom that, like everything else in the house, is totally intact. You got pictures on the wall, it's fully furnished. There's even still sheets made on the bed, in the pillow. It's got a head imprint from whoever was there last. And at the foot of the bed is this beautiful fur coat. And the father walks over to it and he looks at it and he's like, this is real fur. This is a really expensive coat. I want to take this for our family. But before he took it, he had a hesitation. Is this really abandoned? You know, if someone had been here, they would have seen footprints all over the house, just because there's grime all over the ground, and they can clearly see their footprints from where they've just come in. And he's like, no, this is just a weird situation. It's definitely abandoned, and finders keepers. And so he picks up the jacket and he says, I'm going to give this to mom after I clean it up. And so with the jacket in hand, the father and the kids explore the rest of the house. And when they go outside, they realize it's starting to get late and it's probably time to head back. And so they turn around and they start walking away from these houses towards their cabin. And they get about 50 or 60 meters away when one of the kids said he just had this weird sense that they were being watched. And so he turns around and he's shocked when he sees there is an old woman standing in the bedroom that they had just been in, where the fur coat was. She's got a loose bun on the top of her head. She's got this blue shawl on her shoulders over a cream blouse, and she's glaring at them. When the kid saw this woman, he made an audible gasp, and the rest of the group turned around too and saw this woman in the window. And the feeling was guilt. They're like, oh my goodness, we just stole from this poor woman who lives in this abandoned house. And so right away, the whole group starts walking right back towards the house. They're going to give this jacket back. In fact, the dad is like, I'm so sorry. I shouldn't have taken this. I'm sorry. And as they're walking back towards the property, the woman in the window who hasn't said anything just turns around and walks back into the main part of the house. They can't see her anymore. And so as they're walking closer to the house, they're assuming she's going to come downstairs to retrieve this jacket that they've taken from her. And so they get right up to the front door, and the father is yelling to her, I'm sorry, where do you want me to leave this jacket? I can bring it into you. And they're kind of just waiting for her to come downstairs. And she doesn't. She's nowhere to be found. She's not making any sound. She's not indicating what to do. And so after waiting for a couple of minutes, the kids don't really know what to do, and they're kind of getting uneasy about the situation. And the father is still very confident that he just wants to give this back and make amends, make peace with her, say he's sorry. And so he walks inside. He tells his kids, stay here. I'm going to go give it to her. And he goes inside and he disappears upstairs. And then all of a sudden, from across the street in that decrepit house with the caved in ceiling, they hear one of the second floor windows come slamming down. And at the same time, their dad comes charging down the stairs, no jacket with him. And he's saying, go, go, go. And the kids are spooked from the window getting slammed, and they start running away until they're about 100 meters away from these houses. And they stop and they're panting and they're out of breath. And the kids ask their dad, what happened? And he says to them, I looked everywhere upstairs and I could not find that lady. I don't know where she is. Either she's hiding from us or something, but I happened to be looking out at that other house. Something caught my eye. There was movement, and I saw another person in the second floor of that building that's falling apart. And I watched them slam the window, and then as soon as I did, I heard someone yell, get out. And I ran out after you guys. Now the kids and the dad are absolutely terrified and they want to leave, but they also want one more look at these buildings before they do. And when they had run away, they had stopped behind this big group of trees that obscured their view to the buildings. They were out of sight. And so they begin to peek their heads around the tree until they can see the building, and they can't believe what they see. Standing in the window of the fur coat room is not only the old woman, but also a very tall man who's holding her shoulders and is bending down because his head is too high to look standing. He's crouched down and he's looking out the window next to her, and they're both glaring towards them. The father and his kids are practically falling over themselves to sprint away and back to their cabin. To this day, that family has no idea who those people were, what they were doing there, how they were able to move around without making any noise and consistently hide from them and not leave any footprints. It was all very strange and terrifying stuff. And then the government ended up demolishing those houses almost immediately after they were there, and so they'll never get any answers because everything's gone. So that's going to do it, guys. Let me know in the comments what you thought of today's stories, and I will pin the best comment at the top of the comments section. If you enjoyed today's stories and you haven't done this already, please offer to spot the like button for their next set of bench press, and then once they start